GitHub. We all know it, and we all love it. Who am I kidding? The only reason that I use GitHub is the same reason why you use GitHub. The only reason why that guy over there uses GitHub is the same reason all of us use GitHub. It's because everybody else is using GitHub. If GitHub shut down tomorrow and you were forced to use GitLab or SourceForge or SourceHut or basically anything else out there, you probably wouldn't complain. You might whine a little bit that you have to make a new account, but that's pretty much as far as it goes. Unless you were GNU, in which case I saw this evaluation of the ethical nature of various source repositories. And surprising, literally no one ever, the only one that got a grade A was the one that GNU runs. So the ones that were evaluated were savannah.gnu.org, SourceHut, notabug.org, gitlab.com, github.com, and sourceforge.net. I'm sure if Gitty was on this list, it would probably be down the bottom as well. Now, I can sit here and laugh about what GNU considers ethical, but let's see what the criteria actually is, and I'll let you make up your own judgment. Luckily, they do have everything listed out. Also, there is no D and E rating, so if it falls below a C, it instantly drops to F. Firstly, all-important site functionality needs to work correctly, though it doesn't really need to look nice, in free browsers like IceCat without running any non-free software sent by the site. This doesn't mean no JavaScript whatsoever. They're fully aware that JavaScript can be incredibly useful on the web. But when it is using JavaScript, this needs to be marked as Libre JavaScript. It needs to be detectable as something like Libre.js. And if you're embedding something that isn't based on JavaScript, it needs to be licensed in some sort of equivalent fashion. So it needs to be under some sort of free software license. This right here basically knocks out pretty much everything, even something that most people would consider acceptable, like, say, GitLab, for example. No other non-free software is required to use the site, thus, no Flash. Luckily, Flash is very dead, but this criteria was written quite a while ago. Basically, no embedding something into the site that is proprietary, effectively. It doesn't address whether the server can be proprietary, but the GPL ignores that as well, so I'm going to guess that's not really an issue. Does not discriminate against any class of users or against any site, which right now, a lot of sites would fail this one here. Now, one thing you could argue is that having a paywall does discriminate against a certain class of users. I don't know what they would think about that, though. I know there's nothing in the GPL that says you're not allowed to make money, so I'm not sure. Permits access via Tor, yeah, I think that's just a good thing. If Twitter can let you do it, then I'm sure your source repository can work it out as well. The site's terms of service contain no odious conditions. Basically, there's nothing ridiculous in your terms of service. And once again, yeah, I think everybody wants a good terms of service to work with. Support HTTPS properly and securely, including the site certificates, which, if your site has an account management system and doesn't have its security set up properly, you shouldn't be using that site. But both of these totally reasonable conditions sandwich something that just screams GNU. Recommends and encourages GPL3 or later licensing at least as much as any other kind of licensing. Now, most source repositories don't recommend or encourage any license. They let you use the license you want to use, and that's basically it. But I guess if the site ever mentions that you might want to use GPL v2, it's no longer an ethical site, even though it's one of the FSF's own licenses. So, yeah, that's a good criteria. And if you meet all of that criteria, then you're at least acceptable to host a GNU package. So right now, GitLab, GitHub, and SourceForge.net do not meet that criteria. So let's see what it means to actually be a B-rank site that is good enough to recommend. Firstly, all code sent to the user's browser must be free software and labeled for Libre.js or other suitable free automatic license analyzer, regardless of whether the site functions when the user disables this code, which I think is the same criteria as this big block here. So I'm not sure why it's there. Maybe there's some subtle difference, but at least from my reading, they seem to be the same. At least the second one does differ though. does not report visitors to other organizations, in particular no tracking tags in the pages. This means the site must avoid most advertising networks. Basically, don't track the users, and you know what? Fair enough. Next up, does not encourage bad licensing practices, i.e. no license, unclear licensing, GPLN only, and things like that, and does not recommend non-free licenses for works of practical use. And as I mentioned earlier, basically no one recommends the licenses you should be using. They just say, here are the licenses that are available to automatically generate. You can pick one, or you can just go and make your own license. And I don't have any problems with the B tier criteria. They all seem pretty reasonable. The A tier is where we start getting very FSF, very GNU, with things that have nothing to do with ethics, but they've just got to throw them in here. Firstly, site functions correctly with no JavaScript or other code sent by the site. There's not really any reason why any source repository should need JavaScript enabled. They just have it because it's sort of very embedded into the way that modern development is done. But even Google lets you use it without having JavaScript enabled. Server code release as free software, so that does address my concern from the C tier with this one right here. It wasn't a concern there, but it is a concern in A tier. Encourages use of GPL3 or later as preferred option, offers use of a GPL3 or later as an option, and also does not permit non-free licenses or lack of license for works of practical use. Now, I can understand this. The lack of license is a big one. You should always be forced to set some sort of license, even if it's a license where you just say, I don't care that this exists, do whatever you want. Not having a license puts a project into this weird legal grey area where it's not really sure what can actually be done with it. Whether you're allowed to submit code to it, whether you're allowed to fork the project, whether you're even allowed to see that code. So you shouldn't be encouraging not having a license. What I don't agree with is not permitting certain kinds of licenses, even if you personally don't like them. I wouldn't consider this to be ethical. I would consider this to be an odious TOS condition. The source repository should have no say in how I license my code. You are there to hold my source code, and that is all. Forcing a kind of license or not allowing a kind of license is not ethical. It shouldn't need to be said no matter what the FSF and GNU say, but forcing people to do things is not ethical. That should be obvious. Does not recommend services that are services as a software substitute, which is basically a long-winded way to say does not recommend cloud-based software. Now, I think for the most part that is a good criteria, but there are some things like a cloud-based CI system built into your source repository which could be beneficial, and if they're in your otherwise ethical source repository, I would assume those are ethical as well, but maybe GNU disagrees. Says free software, not open source. That also includes, doesn't say free and open source software, which some of them do, and GNU's not a fan of that. Clearly endorses the free software movement's ideas and freedom. Fair enough. Avoid saying Linux without GNU when referring to GNU Linux. It's Linux, that ship has sailed, no one is going to call it GNU Linux besides you. This is not an ethical thing, this is an ego thing, and I don't think they're ever going to let it up. And then insist that each non-trivial file in a package clearly and unambiguously state how it's licensed. Once again, clear licensing is always a good thing, and this should be encouraged, if not forced, on every source repository. But once again, these relatively reasonable things with this sandwiched in the middle. Also, once again, GPL v2 and AGPL v2 are not ethical as defined by GNU, which I'm not going to stop finding funny. And then meeting that criteria and everything earlier is going to put you into the A tier, and as I mentioned earlier, GNU's offering is the only thing that is truly perfectly ethical. And do you want to see why SourceHut missed out? Because it's really, really dumb. Firstly, allows non-free licenses and no license. Now, I already said why I disagree with this, but allowing non-free licenses makes the service more ethical, so GNU is just wrong about that. Service description mentions 100% free and open source software, which breaks both A6 and A7, which was these two right here. Next up, it says, runs fully virtualized builds on various Linux distros and BSDs. I wonder if it supports Alpine, because if you're talking about Alpine and also Ubuntu, this is a more accurate descriptor. You can't say GNU Linux when you're talking about things that are not GNU Linux. And then also has no requirement to make sure that every single file is clearly and unambiguously licensed. And fair enough, I think that's something that could be improved. But these three missing out are basically just feed our ego or you're not ethical, which is a weird way to define ethics. There's also some extra good boy points that obviously they're offering hits all of them that you can get in the extra credit. Allows visitors to look and download without authenticating, which I think basically every service allows. Does not log anything about visitors, fair enough, no more tracking. Follows the criteria in the EFF's best practices, fair enough. Webcon accessibility, yeah, cool. Accessibility is good. More accessibility from this standard right here. And all data contributed by the project owner and contributors is exportable in a machine-readable format, which I think GitHub lets you do. I think a lot of them actually let you do that. Now, I don't think this list is entirely bad. I think all of this extra credit stuff is really good. I think a lot of these, like, one-off points in here are also fairly good as well. But it kind of does read like the entire list was made around their offering, and then they sort of expanded it out to apply it to everything else. So that their offering is the only truly ethical one, and then everyone is slightly less ethical, even if it's just for some really, really dumb things that have nothing to do with ethics. So in the comment section down below, let me know what you think. Do you think this list is reasonable? Or do you think that in some places it sort of just step outside of the realm of ethics and more into boosting up GNU? I would love to know. So if you like this video, I'm going to go and like the video. If you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, go check out my Patreon, subscribe, starting Bearer Pay, link in the description down below. I've got a podcast called Tech Over Tea. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie Robertson Plays. That's going to be it for me, and